Our first speaker today is Michelle Vollmer from the Iowa DNR, and I'll let her go ahead and introduce herself.
Good morning. I'm going to try and get away with not using the microphone since it's pretty sparsely populated, and I think we're good. If you have trouble hearing me, wave, flag me down, do whatever you need to do. As Tim mentioned, my name is Michelle Vollmer, and I work with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources in the Lake Restoration Program. My colleague and one of the originators of the program are also in the room, George and Mike. And the thing I want to start off with is that this has been a long-time collaboration between our program, other folks at the DNR, and Iowa State University. We work a lot with the Center for Agricultural and Rural Development. That's Kathy Kling's group at ISU, and a couple of our postdocs were involved in this project in particular, as well as Rebecca Krogman, who is a research biologist for the Iowa DNR. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge all those folks right up front. I'm going to talk a little bit about first our program within the state, and then some of the things that we've learned throughout the 10 or so years that the program's been going. The first thing is that Iowans love their lakes. So we started this survey back in 2002, and one of the driving forces was we wanted to see how Iowans used their lakes and what they got out of them. And through that, over like 6 surveys now, we've learned that about 60% of Iowans visit our lakes on an annual basis, and then on average, they make about 8 trips a year. They're going and visiting pretty frequently, and it's a huge part of our state's economy. Statewide, all of our lakes generate about $1.6 billion in annual spending. So that's a really key piece of Iowa's economy that we want to make sure that we acknowledge and think about as we're completing restoration projects. But as many of you probably know, not only from being in this conference, but of living and being around Iowa, Iowa's lakes need restoration. If you look at the 2 maps up top, the one on the left shows you what Iowa used to look like, and the one on the right shows you what Iowa looks like today. And that is, we've converted about 90% of the land coverage over the course of the state in the last 150 years or so. We used to be predominantly grassland, shrubland with some forested or woodland areas along those wet corridors. And now, as you can see, the brown is cropland. So we've really massively changed the land use in the state, as you're all likely aware. 70% of our lakes in the state that we monitor on a regular basis are considered impaired under the Clean Water Act. That means that they either have a TMDL and they're still not meeting their water quality goals, or they don't have a TMDL and are in need of one. And there are relatively few natural lakes in the state. Most of ours are man-made impoundments, and we're going to talk a little bit about how different lakes respond, or different lake groups respond, to some of the restoration activities that we've been doing over the last 10 years. But these are valuable resources, and they need protecting. I want to remind you of that $1.6 billion in annual spending. There's a lot of people that rely on them, not only for jobs, but for recreation. It's where we like to go when we get off work. And to that end, the state legislature created the Iowa Lake Restoration Program in 2006. It was kind of modeled after the federal Clean Lakes program that was established in the 1970s with the Clean Water Act. And over the years, it got defunded, and so the state legislature stepped in and said, this is a priority for our state. We need to make sure that we do restoration and continue to maintain the infrastructure and the health of these systems. To date, they've invested a lot of money. We've invested a lot of money as a state. To the tune of $89.8 million have been invested in our lakes. And that's about $8.2 million annually if we break it out since the start of the program. What's more important, though, I think, is that this is a partnership. And on average, all of the funds that are allocated to the program are leveraged by about a 35% cost share. So it's not only our dollars that are being invested, but counties and cities and other groups are all coming together to work together, kind of in the theme of the conference today, to make these changes happen. And so we've established a number of goals with that program. The first, ensure a cost-effective positive return on investment. We want to see that the citizens of Iowa are getting value for their dollar. We want to see that there's a local community commitment to lake and watershed protection. And I can tell you from the couple of years that I've been involved with the program that if the locals are not 100% behind it, the program or the project doesn't do as well, it doesn't succeed. We want to see a significant improvement in water clarity, safety, so lowering the number of those red flags in terms of beach bacteria advisories or microcystin advisories, and just better overall water quality in our Iowa lakes. and look for a sustainable, healthy, functioning lake system. So that means that the fish community responds better. It means you have clearer water. It means we have lower concentrations of those key nutrients. And ultimately, our end goal is to remove those lakes from the impaired waters. That's a long and lofty goal because it takes a long time and a lot of data to get to that point. So there are a number of different things from a variety of partners that lead to the collective picture of what we call restoration in Iowa. The first, and we try to do this in every project before we hit the lake, is to work in the watershed. And this is where we have a lot of key partnerships with our 319 project coordinators. We work with other bureaus within the DNR, Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, local communities, and we try and capitalize on all of the things going on in the watershed, working on best management practices, both on urban and rural land, trying to improve both public and private land, improving existing watershed ponds and basins, so update things that maybe were installed 20 years ago but need a little work. And then this is usually comprising the initial phase of the project. We try to spend at least 3 to 5 years within the watershed before we tackle in-lake work. It doesn't always turn out to be the case, but that's the goal. And then there are a number of in-lake practices that we typically utilize. Very commonly, we will renovate the fishery. Many of the fisheries across the state are dominated by rough fish, most frequently common carp. And that can cause a number of turbidity problems. If any of you had the opportunity to go to Ben Wallace's talk, you could see talked a lot about how that happened in Black Hawk Lake and how removing some rough fish made a huge difference in water clarity. We install fish barriers, and this is the example one at Black Hawk Lake, to try and prevent re-encroachment of those fish within the lake system. We often do shoreline armoring, like the picture up top, to try and protect the shore and prevent wind and wave erosion from hitting the shoreline. Oftentimes we'll apply dredging, either mechanical or hydraulic, to try and remove some of the existing sediment, especially in some of those systems where there's a lot of internal loading going on. And then we'll install a lot of fish habitat to try and provide a better fishery for the lake when the project is complete. So if you look at where we've been across the state, it's been a busy 10 years. Right now we've got about 24 projects that were considered complete or in maintenance mode, and we always try and go back to projects and make sure that we're maintaining the infrastructure that was installed. We have about 22 projects that are considered active around the state, where we're either actively working in the watershed right now or within the lake. And then there are about 15 that we consider in planning mode. Planning is a huge part of the process in that we're trying to understand what is driving some of the mechanisms that are going on in the lake and what tools might we use from our toolbox that's going to help get the lake where we'd like it to be. So the end all be all is always, are we meeting our goals? Every time we go back to the legislator or we work with other groups, they're like, so are you being effective? And so we use this card survey as a tool to help us understand, are we being effective? We've conducted this survey with Iowa State for since 2002 on and off, and the last survey that we did was in 2014, so a lot of the results you'll see today are from that 2014 survey. We distributed the survey to about 6,000 Iowa residents with an average of about a 52% response rate. That's really good for a survey, and the Center for Ag and Rural Development works really hard to make sure they're hitting up the demographics that match the state's demographics. So it's a representative sample. So the first goal that we always want to address is the question, did water quality and ecosystem health improve following restoration? We're going to look at the program-wide, and then we're going to look at a couple of specific cases to help us answer that question. The first thing I want to key you into is that we developed an index of water quality. Rebecca Krogman and I have been working on this for about 2 years now, and it uses a variety of water quality parameters from the statewide monitoring program that we've put together in a logistic regression model to try and help us sum up all of lake water quality in one number. So we've developed a scale from basically 1 to 100, with 100 being perfect, completely drinkable, wonderful water, to 1, terrible, like sewage. And then we've looked at all of the ambient lake monitoring data for the lakes where restoration work has been completed. And we've divided that out into any data that happened pre-project, during the middle of the project, and in this case we're going to consider middle of the project where there's active lake work. and then post-project. And you can see that we've got some mixed results. When we parse them out by lake types, you can see that generally there's a more favorable response to our natural lakes and our shallow lakes, especially our shallow lakes and oxbows, and that the picture for constructed lakes is a little bit more muddy. We have quite a few lakes that look like they improved pretty dramatically, some that kind of stayed pretty consistent, and even some that look like they declined. And hopefully we'll get into some of those cases here in a minute. Because it is a mixed picture for constructed lakes, we wanted to take it a step further. We've worked on a lot of these projects, and some of them were pretty early where we focused pretty heavily in the lake itself and didn't spend so much time doing watershed work, versus some where we've invested heavily both in the watershed and the lake. So we kind of parsed these two groups out into what we're calling extensive renovation, where we saw a lot of watershed and a lot of in-lake work, versus partial renovation, where we may have only fixed like a wetland within the watershed or didn't do as much work. And so you can see that even still we have somewhat of a mixed picture when you look at an individual lake. I'd also like to point out that there's not a ton of data feeding this model. We go and and monitor each of these lakes 3 times annually. And if the project was finished in 2014, that's only 6 samples that we're relying on for that individual lake. So it's not a ton of data, and we hope to get a clearer picture the longer this project runs. But if you break it out by the types of lakes that we look at, you can see that post-renovation, we're really successful in improving shallow lakes and oxbows. That seems to be a pretty consistent response about all of them, and that's most often picked up, especially in the water clarity. And a key component of that is that fishery renovation that we've kind of mentioned. There's still somewhat of a mixed picture in the other types of lakes. The other question that we want to look at is, okay, so if we take an individual lake and we compare post-water quality results to pre-water quality results, do we see a difference? So we did a variety of t-tests to try and determine if we made a significant difference in the water quality on our restored lakes. Of the 20 lakes we tested, 30% showed significantly better water quality following restoration, which I think is a pretty great success, especially when you consider how little data is feeding this test. 50% of all lakes showed no significant change. And that's where we kind of run into that problem with we don't have a ton of data feeding the model, and many of these lakes have only recently been completed. So the longer that we monitor water quality, we would expect to see that as there's more data going into it, we might be able to pick up on some of those differences. And then, unfortunately, we saw 20% of the lakes showed a significant decline in water quality. There's a couple of lakes where we know why this is driving it. Either one, there was very little done. We did a little shoreline armoring, and that was the only part of the project that was completed. Or in one case, there was an over a 50% land use change in that watershed in the 15-year period since we started, where most of the land went from grassland to cropland. And so it's really hard to overcome that with whatever restoration activity you're doing when you have that significant a land use change. Our biggest positive changes were generally observed in those natural lakes, and the extent of the restoration activities, that is how much we were able to accomplish with our partners as a part of the project, did have an influence on these t-test results. The age of the project may also influence them too, so either the project is really old or the project is very recently completed. And I think there's some things that are driving whether or not we're seeing a significant difference for some lakes, considering when we have data for and when we don't have data yet. So again, we've kind of already highlighted this, but you can see if we concatenate all of the different pieces where we were able to complete extensive renovation, that is doing a lot of work both in the watershed and in the lake, you can see we're pretty effective at improving water quality. But water quality is not just chemical and physical parameters, we all know that. And so we wanted to look at individual cases where we had more selective data. The first being macrophytes or vegetation coverage. If you were able to attend Ben's talk yesterday, you heard about the response that Black Hawk Lake had following a fishery renovation. And we've seen that in several other cases. The project at Prairie Rose Lake was completed in 2013. This is a really extensive partnership that started in 2008 with a watershed project and culminated in shoreline work, some additional wetlands, some targeted dredging, all to help improve, and a fishery renovation, all to help improve water clarity at this lake. If you look up top, you can see that that green picture actually shows a Secchi disc at 0.2 meters, where you can hardly see the disc. And in 2008, when they did some vegetation monitoring at the start of this project, they found 2 plants in the lake. This photo with Darcy here is from this past summer, where there's now over 70% coverage of vegetation, whether either topping out or submerged throughout the lake. So water clarity has improved pretty dramatically to allow for that vegetation to establish. And that's helping fish habitat and providing some of that nutrient uptake that we really need. The average Secchi depth over the course of the project has gone from 2.3 feet on average to over 5 feet on average. So we're getting a lot more light penetration that's allowing those plants to grow. I'm going to touch on Black Hawk Lake as well, because it's, for those of you who didn't have the opportunity to attend Ben's talk, sorry. This is an ongoing project. In fact, we're working right now to dredge this area, this inlet, this summer, and help provide a lot of additional nutrient storage for the lake. And there's been a very active watershed project there for 5 years or so that's been incredibly successful at putting a lot of different practices on the ground. Prior to the project starting, especially the watershed project, which started in 2012, no plants were observed in the lake. I did part of this veg mapping when I was a graduate student, and no matter where we drove on Black Hawk, you didn't see anything. It always looked like this in the summertime. Following the fishery renovation that we were able to complete in 2012, we saw a lot of plant growth. In fact, basin-wide plant growth. And there have been some challenges there. Now we're actually working to establish a balance, both through herbicide application and a vegetation harvester, to hit that happy medium point for vegetation control while also maintaining good water clarity. Another thing we always try to look at is the fishery. We don't have a statewide program that establishes really consistent fishery measurements, but we try and always do surveys on the front end and the back end of a project to get a handle on things. Plus, we always go back because those fisheries continue to develop. So we're going to use Black Hawk again as an example, and these are very simplified pie charts, but they kind of estimate what relative biomass looks both before and after the renovation. So prior to the renovation, about half of the total biomass was tied up in rough fish, most often common carp and gizzard shad, and bigmouth buffalo. After the renovation took place in 2012, they completely restocked it with a number of sport fish, and now if we look at the sampling from this past year, the sport fish have been dominating. Those desirable species that help maintain that good water quality are dominating the population, and there's only a few rough fish in the mix. The other thing that we wanted to look at is, does human behavior change as a result of restoration? There are a couple of things I'm going to key you in onto this, because over the course of the survey since 2002, Iowans have generally changed how they use lakes. And so everything has to be viewed in that lens. The first thing I want to key you in on is that visitation has changed. Our earlier surveys had higher visitation generally statewide than our more recent surveys in 2009 and 2014. And our colleagues at Iowa State explain this largely through the economic downturn that the country experienced in 2008. It's slowly rebounding, but we haven't seen the complete rebound yet. So as a result, I want you to think about when we talk about changes in visitation with that lens. We also see that data are pretty skewed, and that there are relatively few lakes across the state with extremely high visitation, and some that are well below the median. Quite a few that have very few trips per year. But we also know that we want to provide opportunities for Iowans all across the state, and that they can't always travel to those 1 or 2 destination lakes. So we wanted to know, did visitation increase following restoration? So after we corrected for that change in the statewide visitation rate, we wanted to look at individual lakes where we've done restoration. And we can see that in about half of our lakes, visitation went up. In some cases, pretty substantially following the restoration project. This could be because of increased water clarity. This could be because there were better opportunities economically, more opportunities for staying in a hotel or different boating opportunities, or better fishery. And so we see that there, in some cases, has been increased visitation. Unfortunately, we also see that there has been a downturn in some of our lakes. But I'd like to point out that at least in a few of these cases, they're very, very recently completed restoration projects. In fact, Carter Lake, for example, was only completed in 2012, 2013, and the survey was taken in 2014. And oftentimes it takes a few years for the fishery to rebound after we would do a fishery renovation. So some of those numbers may be a little bit misleading because the lake hasn't completely reached equilibrium yet. The other question we want to know are people driving farther to go to these restored lakes? If we think that they might like better water clarity and hear about the project going on, maybe they'll drive farther to go to this lake now. And so again, I want to key you in, travel distance has changed a little bit over the course of this survey. In 2002, people were driving a little bit farther, and if you look way over to the 2014, you can see that both the distance, the average distance that people travel, and the window of the range that they generally travel has tightened up quite a bit. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through these next couple of slides. What we looked at was we looked at all non-restored lakes for this versus all restored lakes. And we could see that in restored systems, people generally were driving farther. That is, on average, they were driving about 8 miles farther to visit a restored lake versus a non-restored lake. While there isn't a significant difference yet, we do think that we're starting to see a pattern. Because if we look at the same data set from 2002 and 2014, in 2002 we didn't really have any restored systems yet. And then we started to see a divergence. So the longer this has gone, the more the travel distance is increased for those restored systems. So we're hoping that that trend continues and that the next time that we do this survey, we can start to see a significant result in that people are traveling farther for a restored lake. We also wanted to look at individual lakes. And we could see that, again, in about 60%, people are traveling a little bit farther following restoration as opposed to pre-restoration. We wanted to know, do people, when they hear about a project and the extent of the project, are they changing their behavior maybe and going and trying a new lake? And so quite a few lakes we've actually seen an increase in how far people are willing to travel. A couple of them, I would point out, are really closely located to one another, and we've restored a number of lakes in the same area. And then those are lakes all right around Creston. And so as more and more projects have been completed in that area, it's become somewhat of a destination, especially for anglers, to try and hit up a variety of lakes in one small area. And so I think that's part of what's driving some of those travel distance numbers for those lakes. Again, we do see some lakes where people are not traveling as far following restoration. And some of those I would point to either very old projects where there have been changing conditions in recent years, like Viking Lake and Lake Icaria, both of which were excellent fishing lakes for a while, but now there has been a reintroduction of rough fish. And there has been a lot of land use change in both of those watersheds as well. And some of them are very recent projects like Carter Lake, where I don't think we have enough data to really say. The other thing that I was really interested in learning was, what do people say is the most important thing when they visit a lake? And then does their behavior match what they say it does? And I know I'm running out of time, so we'll try and run it through it fast. So back in 2002 when we asked this survey, we gave people some importance points. And we asked them to rank what they saw as most important. And I just want to point out two things, because they're what we're going to focus on. Water quality and proximity. The vast majority of people said water quality was the biggest factor for choosing a lake, then the proximity. We asked them again in 2014, the same question. Again, water quality always rises to the top. The most people see that water quality is the driving factor behind their decision to recreate at a lake. It matches the previous survey. And again, proximity ranks pretty high. But when we plot it, we don't always see that story. We have, through the survey, the distance that every person traveled to every lake that they said that they went to, and then we plotted it against the average water quality score for that lake. And you can see there's not much of a relationship there. I was hoping that there would be a nice linear relationship, and yes, their behavior matches exactly what they say it does. If we start to look at proximity, though, we can see that that's actually a pretty good driving force for where people are recreating. So if we looked at the number of households within a buffer, essentially, of a lake, we could see that when there was a lake that was closer to higher population centers, there was also much higher visitation, except in a couple of cases. The Iowa Great Lakes are not next to a big population center, but they are a big driver. Similarly, those federal flood control reservoirs bring huge audiences to them, but are not necessarily close to a major metropolitan area. Of course, Saylorville is, as well as Coralville, but Rathbun definitely isn't. Clear Lake is also a major destination lake. So we started to parse this out on a map. And in the gray, you can see all the municipalities that have populations of over 10,000 people. And most of the blue dots is in the highest visitation quartile are really close to those population centers. There are a few notable exceptions. And you can see that this is where we have an opportunity to work because we know where people are going. And we know where there are opportunities where maybe they're underutilizing an area that's close to a metropolitan population center, but if water quality were improved, their visitation might go up. So this gives us a little bit of a direction in the future where we can target places like Badger Creek. Or relative to Big Creek and Saylorville, Easter had very low visitation, even though it's right in the middle of Des Moines. And so there are opportunities that we can see through this survey for how we might work as a program to influence both providing resources that people want to utilize and match what they say they want with what they actually end up choosing. So what we learned is the lakes are important recreationally, environmentally, and economically for the state. We want to continue to invest with our partners in those lakes and try and provide quality resources for everybody to utilize. Restoration projects around the state have really affected visitations rates and water quality, but the picture is still somewhat unclear, and that with more time and more data, we'll be able to get a clearer picture. Renovation is most successful in systems where we truly tried to flip the state. We threw the stable state of the lake. We threw everything we had in it, both in the watershed and within the lake. And that we did see a pretty significant change in quite a few of our lakes. We also have some questions that we want to continue to develop with some of those visitation and water quality preferences. We want to look at what types of activities people are doing when they go visit each lake. In 2014, we asked for the first time, what activity do you do at each lake that you go and visit? And we hope to build upon that in the future to see how activity use might change with restoration. Similarly, how visitation and then subsequently spending might change with restoration. And we also want to look more at that average distance traveled versus other different importance points, aspects, when we think about where people are going and how they're utilizing a resource. So there's more to come. With that, I want to acknowledge all the great people that I work with and helped write this talk. George, of course, is here, and Rebecca. And then these are my collaborators, Ho Chil, Zhongji, and Kathy Kling over at Iowa State. And so I'll take whatever time we got left for questions.
We got about a minute and then 10 minutes between, so let's give Michelle a hand. Questions?
Yeah.
Have you looked at trying to sort out or kind of deconstruct methods as it might relate to success?
Yes. We started down that path, and the general conclusion that Rebecca and I got was that we need way more data than we had and better records than we had. Because a lot of these projects took place over a really long period of time, and each lake is so unique that it's really, really hard to standardize them all and put them in a bucket of shoreline restoration and wetland, and that's a long-term goal, but we're not where we want to be with it yet. Yeah?
Just really quick, a constructed lake would have a different structure than a natural lake? So
They often process nutrients and things a lot different. Generally, we have a much larger watershed to the lake area ratio, so there's a much bigger watershed driving what's going into that lake. They generally have a much faster flushing time, so water's coming in and leaving the lake a lot faster than a natural lake. And in many cases, they're a lot deeper than our natural lakes. Most of our lakes in Iowa are pretty shallow that are natural. And so they do process nutrients a little bit differently, and we think they respond a little bit differently, especially where there's a fishery renovation that occurs. No, no.
Anyway, when you talk about in your survey, people rated water quality as one of the highest priorities in the survey. Did you also ask what they were referring to when they thought of water quality? Does it mean my kids can swim in it, can I fish in it?
Oh, yes, we did.
Did you basically ferret out what they really were thinking about when they said water quality is most important?
We didn't connect the two questions like that, but yes, we did ask a question, especially in some of our early surveys, about what importance points they gave to different water quality things. Like a hard sandy bottom was very important to people. They liked that. They liked being able to see their feet when they could stand waist high in it. So water clarity was really important. We tried to break it down in a meaningful way and not say like nutrients or, you know, a swimming beach. We tried to give preference points that are along the lines of water quality, but maybe not so directly connected. They're more of the response variable than the predictor variable.
I have one quick.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you looked at the behavior changes and distance travel, that sort of thing. If you parsed out the lakes where you saw big differences before and after versus where you didn't, and if that had any sort of
We
relationship.
started trying to do that, and again, we ran into what I'm calling the lack of data syndrome.
Yeah.
Where we would only then have like 3 lakes as our sample size, and they were completed in 2012, and we asked the survey in 2014. So I kept sitting there like, is this really valid?
Right,
Did people's
right.
behavior really change in 2 years? Do I know? Has the lake even reached equilibrium to where it's going to sit for the next 20 or 30 years?
Right.
And so that is, again, a long-term goal, is to parse out where we saw huge improvement. Did things change? It was also one of the driving questions behind why we started this project to begin with. Is I was looking at the differences in surveys between like 2009 and 2014, and I went, visitation went down at this one. I don't understand why. And then I started reading more and more, and it's like, well, I wonder if activity use changed. But 2014 was the first year we asked them about activity use, so
There's no way.
I couldn't figure it out. We tried. We tried parsing it out by zip code and which lakes people went to and which activities they did, but it wasn't enough resolution that we were really comparing apples to apples, and so we kind of abandoned it and said, this is a question for future projects.
Ask you again in 5 years. then.
Yes, or 10.
Or 10.
Along those lines, Michelle, so you talked about how visitation went down in 2009 as a response to the economic downturn. However, as we'll learn about later today, fishing license sales went up in 2009 in response to the exact same economic downturn. So you have some confounding factors going right there. People aren't wanting to travel that distance because they can't afford to go to the lake, but they're buying fishing licenses, so they're potentially replacing that visit to one lake with a visit to a closer to home lake.
Yes.
Right.
And so you just have all these various things bouncing up and down within the same set.
And we do have a very limited data set where we've asked the same people, the repeat surveyors. And so that is a question that we want to look at. Are there trade-offs for things like proximity over the lifespan? The other challenging factor, though, is we've been running this survey since 2002, and all those people are now 17 years older or whatever than they were when we started this survey. So their behavior might change, not because of where they're, traveling because of cost, but it might be changing because they don't have kids at home anymore, or they're retired, and they're not doing what they used to do 20 years ago. And so that is another challenge that we have. I would also, you reminded me of one point that I had meant to make earlier, which was this survey does a really great job on a statewide basis. It gives us a picture of what's going on statewide, but it's maybe less valuable for an individual lake. And so we're starting to supplement a lot of this work with individual creel surveys at lakes that are refining our numbers. Yes, Jeff is shaking his head because this is an ongoing thing that we're working on. We're starting to refine some of the numbers where we've learned that the spending estimate from this survey doesn't really reflect what we're seeing when we do a creel survey. And so the goal long term is to try and reconcile those two processes and get better numbers statewide for every lake.